Just picked the first tomato of the season. This is a Gladiator hybrid. Also got a bunch of other stuff I'm so excited about. I've got lemon cucumbers. I don't know if you've ever grown these, but I'm finding that lemon cucumbers are the most prolific cucumber plants I've ever had. I just picked 9 and there's still a ton on there. But even though it looks like I've got this big, beautiful garden harvest from a big, beautiful, prolific garden, the garden's actually in really bad shape right now, which normally I'm okay with. I know that even the biggest farmers expect to lose about 30% of any of their crops, but July was just really, really hard on some things that I was so excited about. And because I live somewhere that has a really short growing season, I don't really get a second chance for a lot of these things. But I shared a little bit about some of the failures that I was experiencing in the garden on Instagram. And you guys seem to find it really helpful because I know it's easy to look at accounts on the internet and think that everything is perfect, and that is definitely not the case. So I thought today we'd talk about some garden failures and why they're happening and what we can do to prevent them. What better place to start than this adorable pumpkin vine situation that I have on my arch trellises. From a distance, you might be thinking, what's wrong with them? Everything's fine. We've got this perfectly picturesque pumpkin just hanging down here with even more. It's loaded up and it's intertwined with my very healthy, thank goodness, tomato plants. But as we make our way down the vine, suddenly it becomes clear that something is very wrong here. This is caused by a pest that the only way I've found to prevent it from happening is by waiting to plant until later in the season. And normally I do that, but I convinced myself this year it would be fine and I could have early plantings of my squashes and pumpkins and there wouldn't be any issues, and that didn't work out for me. Squash vine borers ended up getting, I would say, 90% of my squash plants that I planted as my first round of squash. Now, normally what I do to prevent this is I just kind of wait it out and I don't plant my first planting of squash. Don't mind the crows. They're really, really chatty today until like mid-July, because that's kind of like the end of the main hatching cycle for the squash vine borers. So they're laying their eggs, but there's nothing for them to lay on. They won't be here in the first place when that late planted crop of squash and pumpkins actually sprouts. If you don't find the squash vine borer in your squash vine before it's too late, your plant can go from one day seeming totally fine to just the very next day be completely wilted and dead. So it's something that is better dealt with before it happens, and you can do that by just looking out for the squash vine borer eggs and also taking note of any kind of like crumbly sawdust that forms. I've packed dirt, kind of like a dirt band-aid, onto the incision site, and on this one it seems to be working. I think I caught the bug early enough and the plant was established enough that it seems like it's been okay. Now, this pumpkin was also really well established, but you can see a lot of signs of die-off starting from the base going up the plant. I haven't pulled it yet because I'm holding out hope that it might bounce back still because it was such an established plant, but if the damage is just too severe, there's only so much I can do. And I have to also keep in mind my days to maturity. If I am gonna try to plant a replacement pumpkin plant on this arch, I need to kind of get it going pretty soon. So I could put that seed in now, and basically if the plant survives, I'll just pull the seedling out. And if it doesn't, the seedling will already be in place. I can cut down the existing plant and the new seedling can replace it. Continuing the disease trauma that we're experiencing on the trellises, we've got our cucumbers. So even though I did say that they've been really prolific, one thing that I'm noticing is that some of these varieties have succumbed to a pretty bad case of cucumber leaf blight, and I'll show you how you can recognize that. So leaf blight will start off as like 1 or 2 spots on a leaf, and you can kind of start to see through it. This one has a hole. But another key feature of leaf blight is that it has this kind of bullseye ring where the brown gets darker and then it fades to yellow. So this continues to spread and progress throughout the leaves until they really just start browning and dying off completely. And without the leaves, the cucumbers themselves are really susceptible to sun scald. So it does overall affect the productivity of the plant, and it's something where the only thing you can do once you have it is to cut those plants down and quickly succession sow rounds of cucumbers, because they are really fast growers and they're really prolific and they're very susceptible to diseases. preventing it by just succession sowing and removing plants before they have the chance to get diseased is honestly the simplest way to handle it. I did succession sow some cucumbers, but they didn't come up because of that heat wave. You need to be very careful when you're direct sowing in a heat wave. You've got to keep everything cool, you've got to keep everything damp, and those seeds can kind of go dormant. But this plant, even though it is diseased, it's still producing. So we're just kind of leaving it right now because it's not going to spread to other types of plants, just cucumbers. And in the meantime, we still have some that we can harvest. I just think this view is hilarious because maybe to you guys it doesn't look super bare, but the front rows here as compared to the back row, it's just like a night and day difference from the front of the beds to the back of the beds. I mean, just look at how much more lush it gets. But even while my front beds are kind of suffering and I'm waiting for them to bounce back, there's been a couple of things in smaller containers that have been doing really well up until recently. I can't explain it, but this container has been so happy. And I know it still looks happy, and it mostly is. There's just one thing that I'm dealing with it. But this is actually a ground cherry plant, which these are kind of polarizing. People either love them or hate them. I personally think they're delicious. I haven't been able to harvest off of this one yet, but what's cool about this is I actually planted seeds from 2020 and none of them came up for my ground cherries. And then I just looked in this planter a couple of weeks ago and noticed that one had self-seeded there. So it's doing really well, and I'm very excited to have a kind of volunteer ground cherry plant in here with my summer squash. This summer squash was actually really stunted in growth for a few weeks, and I think that kind of ended up being a blessing in disguise because the squash bugs didn't seem to notice it, and I just fertilized it and it like quadrupled in size in like a week along with this. But what's happening with these and with that container over there, which has a melon in it, is we have a new visitor to the garden. It's not new to the property, but basically we have this groundhog that lives in the field behind me, and it sometimes comes up into the yard and it's very brave. And the other day I saw it wandering through this area, and all of a sudden I noticed nibbles on some of my lower down stuff that had been doing really well. And so far it's nothing dramatic. It's just the ends of things, like they're just taking a sample to see what they like. Also not great, but I can deal with that as long as they do end up leaving things alone. It can be really difficult to deal with larger animals in the garden. I get a lot of questions about deer. This isn't something that I have trouble with around here because they have plenty of other things to eat, even though they do walk right through here. With the groundhog, it's been here for years, and it'll usually damage a few main things and then move on because it has other things it can eat. But if it were becoming a bigger issue, I would consider trying something like a cayenne spray. It doesn't hurt the groundhog at all. It's just something where they don't like the way that it tastes. The only downside to that is that you do have to reapply it often. Anytime it rains, it's gonna wash away. This is another bed where I feel like from a distance, it looks so lush and full, but then you get up close and you see this. And this is caused by a couple different bugs, one of which is right here. And I'll spare you the story I have about why I hate earwigs so much, but they're not the only ones responsible for defoliating these plants. The other main cause that we have a ton of around here are Japanese beetles. And unfortunately, if you want to deal with Japanese beetles in an organic way, which generally that's what I'm doing here, I have never used any chemicals in my garden, you're pretty much left with the only option being hand picking them and dropping them into soapy water. These guys will decimate things like nothing else. They've done it to my fruit trees, they're doing it to all my beans, to my pineapple, sage, my flowers. They're very indiscriminate in how they take down a garden, and it can be a huge bummer when you have them. And they're really common, especially here in Massachusetts. So the best thing that you can do is just try to get ahead of them. Do your kind of quick sweep every morning if you can. I try to come out here for 5 to 10 minutes and just pick off anything that I see. But unfortunately, it is just kind of something that we have to contend with here, and I just try to support the plants in as many other ways as I can by fertilizing them so that they can continue to put on new growth. Something's also been eating my tomato plants, but this is a case where I literally went to bed, came back out the next morning, and all of this damage had been done. And then by the same night, not even 10 hours later, this one had suffered a similar fate. But with tomatoes, it's not usually Japanese beetles that are causing this. It's usually hornworms, and hornworms are absolutely foul, disgusting bugs. I know I try to tell you that pests are a part of the garden. No matter what you do, you're going to have them. Your garden is a part of the ecosystem. A healthy garden does have pests, but I hate hornworms because of how quickly they can completely decimate a plant. Like, I'm talking within 12 hours, I lost all the foliage off of 2 of these tomato plants. Some people will say that planting marigolds and basil in the same bed can help to deter them. I do have both of those in these beds. They're not super huge plants, but I think if it were gonna work, then it would be working. Unfortunately, the next best option, if that doesn't work for you, is the same as with Japanese beetle, and that's just to hand pick them. A lot of people feed them to their chickens. I feed them to my crows. With integrated pest management, I'm always trying to think of new ways to kind of deter these bugs that we don't want and attract the ones that we do want to keep everything in balance. But I mean, I pretty much have every pest deterrent companion plant you could think of in these beds, and I've only had 1 hornworm so far. So I do think it's doing its job in that regard. You're always gonna have some casualties. It doesn't mean that your garden is a complete failure. And I'm saying that as much for myself as for you, because I have been going through it since this heat wave hit. It's been a lot. Like, I've been feeling kind of like a failure because the garden, although it looks okay from a distance, is nowhere near as productive as I would expect it to be because we're dealing with such wild weather extremes. Last year, we got too much rain. We had tons of fungal disease. This year, we're getting hot and dry weather, and it's hard to keep on top of. Plant growth is stunted, and there's diseases that will happen whether the imbalance is caused by heat, wet, cold, dry. It doesn't matter. There's always going to be some kind of imbalance that you're trying to address. They will not quit. I guess I'm just saying this to remind myself that the garden has so much to give outside of the physical objects that we might or might not harvest. And it's really just a space for me to come back to myself and connect with nature more than it is a place where I need to be filling a harvest basket every single day. I need to be feeding my family exclusively from this. That's not my goal here. I know that's the goal for a lot of people. I'm not a farmer. I'm not a homesteader. I'm a backyard gardener. And I'm also not sharing this to be negative. Like, I've got lettuce going to seed here. I see so many positives in that. I truly do. The lettuce flowers are beautiful. It's creating a whole new life cycle for me that I can replant this lettuce from. Like, there's so many benefits to the things that we often just assume are totally bad or have no value if you kind of just try to reframe things. And I guess that's my overall point is, yes, we're kind of just managing the diseases and pests at this point, and we can't control that, but we can control our attitude that we have about it. Anyway, thank you so much for gardening with me and the crows today. I hope this was helpful. Make sure you hit like and subscribe if you want to see more of my videos, and happy gardening.